Pay attention, because today I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. I'm going to teach you the one thing that everybody wants to know, but that has eluded philosophers and scientists and everyone for all of human history: how to be happy. Okay, that's maybe a little bit of oversimplification, but we do understand happiness a lot better than we used to, and it isn't as difficult as we think, but we have set our society up in such a way as to make it very difficult to actually experience happiness, and we've been sabotaging ourselves. So we're going to talk about what it is on a physiological level, and then also how to actually use that knowledge to your advantage to experience happiness and more life satisfaction on a regular basis, on a day-to-day basis, to make your life just better. So what is happiness? Well, the first thing we need to understand is the difference between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is short-term feeling good, and happiness is that sense of just contentment and satisfaction, and that you feel kind of all over, just all the time. Even when things are maybe going a little bit stressful, maybe you've got a busy day ahead or whatever, you still overall feel happy with your life. Whereas pleasure is a piece of chocolate cake or candy or whatever that feels good right now in that moment. So we'll talk more deeply about that. But understand that when I talk about happiness, I'm talking about general life satisfaction. I'm not talking about those short-term, immediate doses of pleasure. And that's the first thing a lot of people get wrong, is they say, I want to be happy, but they chase happiness by pursuing pleasure. And that is a critical mistake, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, why is pursuing pleasure over happiness a critical mistake? Because happiness and pleasure are directly related to two neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. A lot of people get them confused as to what they do, and it's important to understand the difference, not only how they act, but how they interact with each other. And there's a third neurotransmitter we're going to talk about that throws a whole monkey wrench in the entire thing, and we have to solve that problem in order to really obtain true, genuine life satisfaction and happiness. And lastly, after we understand the mechanisms involved, I'm going to give you some concrete, real-world strategies to reduce your unhappiness and increase your happiness day-to-day, moment-to-moment, and moving forward in your life. We're going to give you some immediate things you can do right now in the moment. We're going to do some short-term things that'll yield benefits over the next few hours and days. And then we're going to give you long-term strategies that will compound over time and just lead to a general better sense of life satisfaction, happiness, fulfillment, contentment. So what is happiness? Happiness is a sense of life satisfaction, of fulfillment and contentment in life, and having a general meaningfulness to your existence. People are unhappy when they don't feel satisfied, when they don't feel like what they're doing makes a difference. Think about like all the people out there, maybe you, who feel like your job is pointless. One of my favorite movies, Office Space. It's great. It's like, yeah, my job is pointless. It has no meaning whatsoever. I fill out paperwork and I don't see where this is going. I don't see that it means anything. That is very, very different from pleasure. Pleasure is simply that momentary impulse of this feels good right now. When you are seeking pleasure, it's something that you like, I want more of. When you eat a piece of cake that tastes good and sweet in your mouth, you want more. Whereas happiness is really, I'm good here. And this comes to one of the prime understandings of differences, what these are, is because these two different states of being come from two different neurochemicals. So we're talking about two feel-good chemicals, dopamine and serotonin. Feel-good chemical number one is dopamine. This is the one that when you do something for the first time and you succeed, you get that rush, I did it, I feel so good. Or like when you are playing a game and you win and you want to jump up and down and celebrate, yeah, I won. And, or when you get a piece of chocolate cake and you go, oh, that tastes so good, I want another bite. That's dopamine. It's really exciting and it feels good and it's boom. And what it does, what it's meant to do, is it motivates you. It gives you a reason to do something. People say, I have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I don't have a reason to get out of bed. Because there's nothing that gives them dopamine when they get out of bed. Like, why would I get out of bed? Nothing feels good. Right? So dopamine is your motivator. Once you've done something that triggers dopamine, you want to do it again. And that's also a key thing, little small sidebar there. Motivation comes after you do something, not before. When you say, I don't really want to work out, Okay, I'm gonna go work out, and then you do your workout and you feel really good. And then you're motivated. Now the next time you don't really want to work out, your brain is gonna remember that dopamine rush you got from working out, and it's gonna, oh, well, working out's not so bad, man. It made me feel pretty good. So let's go do that. That's what dopamine does, is it rewards the successful behavior, the good behavior, and makes you want to do it again. Number 2 feel-good chemical is serotonin. This is the opposite of dopamine. It calms you down. This is like when you've eaten a good meal and you're stuffed and you're just like, I don't want any more, I'm good. Or you're getting a massage and you just want to lay there and just bask in that moment. Even after the massage is done, I don't really want to get up. I just want to stay here, right here, do this. You're just calm and relaxed and just feeling really good. This is how you feel after sex. This is how you feel after a good meditation session. This is how you feel laying in the sun by the pool or on the beach when you're just out in nature and you just want to sit and enjoy it. That's serotonin. So one of the main differences between serotonin and dopamine is excitatory. It excites you, it makes you want more, you get excited, it excites the neurons around it to want to get more dopamine. Serotonin is an inhibitor. It calms you down, makes you no longer really wanting to do anything. You just want to chill. And it does the same thing with the neurons around it. Once a neuron gets serotonin, it kind of tells the other guys, hey, calm down, chill out, we're good. When we talk about life satisfaction and happiness, what we're really talking about is serotonin. The interesting thing about that is that nobody's going to be happy all the time. But you kind of know that once a particular crisis is over, or a particular, unhappy period, that eventually you're going to go back to that happiness. So when somebody lacks serotonin, when they're not getting enough, they don't know that. They don't know that that's going to come back. And that's leads to depression. With dopamine, there's an inverse problem, is that the more dopamine you get in your system, the more tolerance you build for the dopamine. So you have to get more and more dopamine in order to feel the same level. And so the level of dopamine in your system goes up, but the level of pleasure you get from the dopamine goes down. And this is what we call tolerance. And as your system gets flooded with more and more dopamine, actually will eventually kill those cells so that you cannot experience it. You can't experience, no matter how much dopamine you get, you're never going to get to that level you were again. And that's the physiological version of addiction. That is the definition of addiction. Chasing dopamine all the time leads to addiction, whereas feeling happy and contented all the time doesn't. You cannot be addicted to happiness because it literally shuts down the drive for things. So you need both. You need dopamine to have that drive, and you need serotonin to have that relaxation, but you need to have them in balance. And what messes that up? Now, the third neurotransmitter we're going to talk about is cortisol. You've probably heard of it. It's called the stress hormone. It has a lot to do with how we handle stress. It basically triggers the fight or flight mechanism in your brain and your nervous system. And it has a very obvious reason for being there, because it's the fight or flight. It tells you when things are really going bad, you need to act now. And one of the problems with this is if you're out in the wild and you're being chased by a tiger, cortisol is great. Boom, your brain, it literally shuts down your prefrontal cortex, your logic center, and tells you to just do something, run or hide or whatever. It sends you into pre-programmed instincts and behaviors because those have been proven to work. And chances are those instincts and behaviors were proven to work earlier in your existence by dopamine. That dopamine helped program those things, and then when you get cortisol from the stress, it triggers those behaviors. But it also shuts down the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is where you do logic and reasoning and where you have the ability to think in the future, to pursue delayed gratification like happiness by putting off something that you would be doing for dopamine right now. So if you have cortisol in the presence with dopamine, what that means is that you will basically not be able to think very far ahead. So you'll engage in a behavior that gives you dopamine, and since you still have that cortisol and you can't think very far ahead, instead of thinking, okay, well, I could do more, but I would be better off long term if I didn't, you just do more. This is what leads to addictions, whether it's shopping, alcoholism, drug addiction, sex, porn, all these things. When you combine chronic stress, chronic cortisol with dopamine, you get addiction. And like I said, the problem with that is that when you have this chronic level of these neurotransmitters in your brain, in your system, it begins to kill off the receivers. They literally die. The cells die. And then you can no longer feel that level of happiness, of pleasure, not happiness, pleasure that you did before. So hopefully now you can begin to see that chronic stress, along with dopamine, creates a downward spiral. So now the body automatically downregulates dopamine because engaging in a behavior that is good at the moment isn't always good long term. So if you think about way back when, when we were first evolving, if you came across a new plant that had fruit on it and you ate the fruit and it tasted good, oh, awesome, we found a new source of food, cool. And you eat that, 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 and you eat that. Well, it's probably not all the nutrients you need, and it's keeping you in one place, which is not necessarily good if you're being stalked by a tiger or something. So dopamine downregulates, so eventually you get bored with that food and you move on. So that's kind of why it does it. But if you continue to just keep forcing the issue, it will literally just kill off the cells so that it doesn't work anymore. And then you're going to have to go look for something else to trigger that dopamine. That's why it does it. Unfortunately, human beings are so smart that we figured out ways around this. This is where we come up with drugs and alcohol and various addictive behaviors that kind of allow us to short circuit the dopamine and flood our systems with dopamine in ways that nature really didn't intend. Same thing, like sugar is one of them. We get a great dopamine burst from eating sugar because it's exceedingly rare in nature, but we've learned how to cultivate it and provide it by the truckload to anybody who wants it all the time. And as a result, we see the problem when we get that constant dopamine from the sugar, and because we downregulate the feeling of pleasure, we then eat more and more sugar, and we see the effects that has on our health. So that's kind of how that addiction model works with dopamine and cortisol. And if you think about it, like just talking about sugar, binge eating, eating your feelings, those kinds of things are dopamine-seeking behavior. And if you're doing it because you're trying to avoid stress, like eating your feelings, you don't want to feel that feeling, I'm going to replace that with a happy feeling that I get from eating. That happy feeling isn't happiness, it's pleasure. You think it's happiness, it's not. It's pleasure, it's dopamine. And you're going to get less and less of that satisfaction from it the more you do it. So this is where that downward cycle from cortisol and dopamine becomes a problem. Now let's talk about the other side of that, cortisol and serotonin. And the first thing to understand about serotonin is you cannot overdose on it. You can't overdose on happiness. So your system will not kill off neurons because you have too much serotonin, because it's an inhibitor. You can only have so much, and then it basically stops happening until you go do something that's going to bring it back. The problem with cortisol, the stress hormone, is it down-regulates the amount of serotonin in your system. So the more stressed you are, the more stress you have, the less you are able to feel happy and content and satisfied. Stress is the opposite of contentment. The good news is that by reducing stress, you upregulate serotonin. And if you pay attention to how these three interact with each other, it's really interesting. So if you want to feel more life satisfaction, one of the key things to do is to bring up your serotonin levels. How do you do that? By reducing your stress levels. What happens to the dopamine cortisol cycle when you reduce the cortisol side of that equation? Well, then you no longer overengage in the dopamine because you're not trying to alleviate your stress with pleasure. You've alleviated the stress already and you have happiness. So the pleasure of the dopamine serves as a motivator, as it should, instead of a replacement for the serotonin that you're missing. So the key to all this is really upregulating your serotonin by reducing your chronic stress. That's the key to happiness. Now, obviously, how you do this for everybody and what brings you those levels of serotonin is going to be different for everybody. So unfortunately, understanding this is great, but I didn't give you the secret to life. Just go do this one thing, because what's going to give you that serotonin is going to vary for everyone. So let's talk about what triggers serotonin and what triggers dopamine. That's the next thing that's important to understand. The first difference between dopamine and serotonin, pleasure and happiness, is pleasure is short term. It's short lived, it's in the moment, whereas happiness is long term. It just goes on and on and on, right? So you can have a bad day, but a genuinely happy life. Whereas pleasure is something that just happens in the moment. The next difference is pleasure and dopamine are visceral, they're physical, they're in your body. Happiness is ethereal, it's mental, you just know when you feel it. It's not about your physical sensation. Pleasure is derived from taking. So think of like winning a game, gambling. That's pleasure. Happiness is derived from giving. They say it's better to give than to receive. When you do something outside of yourself, that's when you begin to feel real pleasure and real contentment, because a lot of times the feelings of pleasure actually come from seeing something an effect you've had on the world, and you can only have an effect on the world by giving, by doing to the world. So giving is where you get pleasure, giving is where you get happiness, taking is where you get pleasure. The next difference is that pleasure is solo, it's individual to you, and happiness is part of a community, it's social. When you're engaged in an activity that brings you pleasure, like eating a cake or drinking alcohol or whatever, you're the only one who feels that. Whereas when you're involved in something like going to a live show, you've got musicians up on stage, you got all these people around you who are excited, and you're all singing along with the songs together and all that stuff. Or you're at a sporting event and you're all cheering for your teams and you're watching the players. There's community there. There's the players on the field, and there's the people around you cheering, and the people cheering against you, and even that rivalry can be really fun. All those kinds of things. That's social. When you're having a conversation with somebody else that you're both really into, when you're with your family for a get together or just dinner, or when you're just like being in the presence of somebody else. Those are happiness things, and that's social, that's serotonin, that's happiness. Whereas the other things are pleasure, where it's just you. Whatever it is that's happening that's giving pleasure is happening only to you. The next key difference between pleasure and happiness is that pleasure can be derived from taking substances, whether it's ingesting food, taking drugs, anything like that. That's where you get pleasure. You can also get pleasure from behaviors, but you cannot get happiness from substances. That's a short term. Remember, happiness is not physical, it's ethereal. So you can get pleasure and happiness through behaviors, but you can only get pleasure through substances. And that's a critical thing to understand, because there was a great study, and this is a way to use dopamine and pleasure to help yourself. There was a great study where they took two groups of people and had them begin daily running practice. And they had the control group, which had to go out and run, a mile or 20 minutes or whatever, every day for like 6 weeks. And then they had the other group, which did the same thing, but when they came back from their running, they ate a little bit of chocolate, just a small little piece, as their reward for having done the running. And that chocolate triggered the dopamine, and they felt good. So then they went back 6 months after the 6 weeks was over and looked at who was still doing daily running. And the people who had eaten the chocolate after the running, who triggered that dopamine after they went for the run, were largely still going on daily runs, whereas those who had not did not continue to run. So they were able to translate that physical pleasure of dopamine from ingesting a substance into a habit forming where they got long-term happiness from the improved health and mental clarity that you get from engaging in exercise. So they were able to translate dopamine into serotonin in a healthy way. That's where you can use the difference between serotonin and dopamine to reinforce each other. So now I want you to think about all these things that give you pleasure and what they have in common. Because once you begin to realize it, once you make this click, this shift in your way of thinking, nothing's going to be the same again. If all the things that bring you happiness are ethereal and they're mental and they're feelings and sensations based on stuff outside of you, and they're not based on anything you can ingest or any substances, then what is it that all the things that give you pleasure that trigger dopamine have in common? These are the very things that we are told will give us happiness. If we buy this thing, if we drink this drink, if we spend this money, whatever it is, if we achieve this goal which is useful to someone else, like a sales goal at work. If we make this sales goal, I'll give you a reward. That's using dopamine as a reward. That's not happiness. That's pleasure. And it's fleeting. And it doesn't lead to long-term happiness if you just keep following the dopamine. All of marketing is based on creating a stress. You're not good enough. You're not happy unless you buy our dopamine thing. You do the thing we tell you you should do that'll give you dopamine. Once you begin to see all of that, you can kind of step back and say, okay, I don't want to do this. But in order to really step back and get out of that, you need to lower your cortisol. And I want to give you an example, a real world example that I think pretty much anybody watching this will remember, that tells you exactly what cortisol does and how dumb we become on cortisol. So if you remember 2020 pandemic, COVID-19 beginning, the panic is rising. Nobody really knows where it's coming from. Nobody really knows how it's transmitted. But we do know that it's very bad, that thousands and thousands of people are dying. We're beginning to shut down our schools and our businesses, and you can't go out to eat anymore. You can't go out to bars. You can't go anywhere. We're all locking down in our homes, and people are stressed. They're really upset. They're scared to death. Cortisol is pumping through their veins. It's flooding their brain. And we have a toilet paper shortage because people were going out and buying literally whole pallets of toilet paper. And then, if you remember, a few months later, people were trying to return the toilet paper. And we have all this toilet paper. What am I going to do with it? This was dumb. It was dumb at the moment they did it, but their brain wasn't thinking because their prefrontal cortex was shut down. They were not doing long-term thinking. They're not doing logic or reasonable thinking. They were just panicking. That's what cortisol does to you. And there's been other studies that show, there's another study that showed that people who live in constant levels of stress make very bad financial decisions, such as buying a ton of toilet paper. But this is one of the reasons why poor people don't make really good long-term financial decisions, because they're constantly stressed and they're living in the now. That's what cortisol does. You live right now, you solve this problem right now. If you have money in your hand and you're hungry, you go out and buy a bunch of food. You don't think, well, I've also got to pay my power bill next week, so I maybe save a little. No, you go buy a bunch of groceries, and the next week come and, well, now I can't pay the power bill. And the power goes off, and the refrigerator goes off, and the food rots, and now I've wasted the money wasted all that food that I stocked up on because it's rotten, and I still don't have the money to pay the power bill. A reasonable person would go, that was a bad, I'm going to buy some food now, and I'm going to pay the power bill next week so the food is good, and then I'll work on the next thing. But if you're constantly under stress, you don't make those kinds of good decisions. That's what cortisol does to you. Now, since cortisol shuts down your prefrontal cortex and your logic and your reason, it's critical to know where it's coming from, because it doesn't really matter where it's coming from. You're going to make bad decisions in every area of your life if you're under stress. But where can you identify areas in your life that are stressed? Well, one of the number one places is work. If you got a lot of stress at work, you need to be able to manage that stress in a healthy way to bring the levels down. If another key one is relationships, romantic relationships. If your romantic life is stressful and you have lots of arguments, or maybe passive aggressive behavior from your partner, or you just can't agree on anything, or maybe maybe that relationship's dead and you're still living in the same household together, and it's just constant silence and just that ick, whatever. All that kind of stress, that's something you need to identify and deal with. Another one is family. A lot of people grew up in very toxic families. So if your family life can be a huge source of stress too, and you can see very clearly when you look at addicts, a lot of times that's where you see is they have everybody has stress at work. That's pretty much what work is. That's a whole other issue. But if you cannot escape that by going home, then there's no escaping. You're going to start making those bad decisions. Cortisol, dopamine, addiction. We all know where that leads. So this is why it's really critically important to understand where the stress is coming from. A lot of people don't see that drama at home as part of their stress. They block it out, and they have it, they experience it to the outside world, even to people who are experiencing it and don't see it in their own lives. You can see it in other people's lives. Like, that's toxic. You don't want to do that. And then you look at them and go, well, what about your life? It's the same way. So really important to pay attention to that kind of stress. And very often people who have those stressful home lives also engage in toxic friendships, especially if they're in that dopamine cortisol cycle. Their friendships are enablers, or somebody who calls them a friend is actually somebody who's using them. This is how all these different stressors come at you from every direction, which is where we lead to chronic cortisol levels, chronic stress, which downregulates our serotonin and our ability to enjoy our life. Hopefully you're beginning to see how it comes from every direction. So those are some of the major external stressors. But we also have internal stressors. There's our internal dialogue, our self-talk, our self-criticizing. We also have, we worry about something in the future. We ruminate about mistakes of the past. These are all other ways in which we create stress. And it doesn't matter. Our brain doesn't know the difference between what's out in the real world and what's happening in our head. If we perceive it internally or externally, it doesn't matter. Our cortisol levels go up. So getting control of those things is also going to be important. There's the media. Advertising, like I already said, advertising is going to tell you, you lack, we have the solution. Well, what if you can't afford the solution? And what if you've tried the solution and it didn't work? You still are getting that message of you lack in some way. There's something wrong with you, you're broken, you're not going to be happy until that kind of messaging. That leads to a lot of stress, internal stress. Same thing with social media, constantly chasing those likes. When you see other people who are doing better than you and you start comparing yourself to them, again, that's an internal thing, but it wouldn't be there if you weren't looking at it. All right, so now we get to the good stuff, the actionable stuff. What do you do to alleviate the stress? Because the key to all of this, like I said, is bringing down your cortisol levels. So hopefully now you've taken a moment, maybe take stock of looking at the ways in your life where you get stress, where your highest levels of stress are, where they're coming from. And now we need to find ways to deal with them. So we're going to look at 3 levels of dealing with that stress, how to lower that stress and therefore improve your quality of life, improve your balance between serotonin and dopamine so that you can bring things back into balance and have a happier, more fulfilling life. So let's start with the most immediate one. So one of my favorites, and the most immediate one, is going to be called the physiological sigh. And this is something I learned from Andrew Huberman. I'm going to include a link below. It's a video for him explaining this. But essentially it works like this. When your exhale is longer than your inhale and more vigorous than your inhale, it triggers your central nervous system into thinking you're in a place where you can relax. When you do that, your heart rate slows down, your cortisol levels drop. Just do that literally in the moment, a couple of seconds. The easiest way to do it, the best way they show, science has shown, is what they call 2 quick inhales and a long exhale. Taking that a little further, takes a little bit longer, but box breathing. This is one that I love to do. So box breathing is 4, 4, 4, 4. So you're going to breathe in for 4, a count of 4, and then you're going to hold it for a count of 4, and then exhale for a count of 4, and hold that for a count of 4. And do that 3, 4, 5 times. And that'll tend to bring people down. That tends to calm you down. And again, it's just it's a physiological way of telling your nervous system, relax. We got this. We're good. Another way to bring down stress is just to go for a walk. 10 minutes of walking releases huge amounts of endorphins and other things into your system that basically just, again, tell your cortisol levels to drop. Chill out. We got this. And this is really good, especially if you're in an argument with somebody and you know what, take a break, I'm going to take a walk. You go out there and do that walk and you can just calm down. And it does calm you down. It lowers your stress level. Okay, and this last one for immediate effect isn't necessarily always appropriate, but it's one I really enjoy, and that is cold exposure. Typically, I would think like a cold shower. Cold shower releases adrenaline and tons of endorphins, and endorphins raise your serotonin levels and lower your cortisol levels. So even though it's a weird thing because when you get into the cold water, it is actually a stressor that for a few seconds is going to raise your cortisol levels for a few seconds. But then your body, your central nervous system counteracts that by releasing endorphins. And then when you get into the warm water or get out of the shower and warm up, all that, you feel really good. And it tends to last for a few hours. So if that's an available option for you, that's a good one too. Just a quick cold shower, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds under a cold shower is all it takes. And you'll feel immensely better. I want to jump in here real quick and say I forgot to add, if you can't do a cold shower, also just splashing cold water on your face triggers the same thing. Just getting that cold exposure tells your nervous system, calm down, releases endorphins. Very, very helpful, very easy to access. So those are some things you can do immediately to lower your cortisol levels in the moment. And these are important because they're physical. When you're very, very stressed, when you're at a high emotional state, it's very hard to get your brain under control. But if you can get your physiology under control, your brain will follow. And that's a key thing to understand. The mind-body connection is real. And so if you cannot get your thoughts to calm down, get your body to calm down and your brain will follow. So now let's talk about some short, medium-term ways of reducing your stress. This is things that are going to last for a few hours, a few days, maybe a week, but they're going to give you a kind of a break to begin to kind of reset. So the first one I'm going to recommend is meditation. Now, meditation is both a short and a long-term thing. It's short-term in that especially when you first begin, you'll feel the effects for maybe a couple hours afterwards. The more you practice it, the longer you practice it, day after day after day, the impact of it grows. Basically all you're doing, and I say mindfulness meditation, perhaps a guided meditation, there's lots of apps. I'm going to leave a link to my favorite one, Insight Timer, below. I think just basic mindfulness with a little timer, a little quiet space, just monitor your breathing and just relax and do that for 20 minutes. That allows your body to relax and just kind of focus on one thing, and your brain to focus on one thing. And that lack of judgment, because that's a big part. Your mind wanders during meditation. You don't judge it. You just say, okay, that's where we went, but we want to be back here. And you just move it back. Those kinds of things, those moments like that will lower your cortisol levels, raise your serotonin levels, and over time, you'll retrain your brain. You'll retrain the neural pathways, so that becomes more and more and more the normal way of living. And as you do that, your chronic level of cortisol will begin to reduce over time. So it works short term for a few hours, maybe a day, 2 days, when you begin, and as you do it over the long term, you see cumulative effects. And we've done studies on long-term meditators, the Tibetan monks and Dalai Lama. We can see massive differences in their brain and their serotonin and dopamine levels and cortisol levels versus regular people. And this is the long-term effects of meditation. So it works short-term. I recommend making it a long-term practice. Next is a dopamine detox. Now, this is a very popular thing right now, and I think it's a really good thing because so much of our world today is built on the idea of triggering dopamine. Like I said, that's advertising, that's how they sell us things, that's how social media works. Clicks are money, and so how do they get you to click? They trigger your dopamine. And you need to downregulate that dopamine by getting away from all of that. Unplugging your TV, turning off your phone, blocking social media, whatever it is that's triggering that you use to trigger your dopamine, turn it off for 24 hours. Just 24 hours. If you can go through 24 hours, you'll notice a radical change in your behavior. One thing on a kind of lower tier level, but if you can use apps to block you from social media and stuff like that for certain times of the day. Block it until lunchtime. I personally find, and I've seen this with my clients, that when you do not engage in those kind of internet-based activities until you've gotten up and gotten into your day a little bit, your overall engagement in those activities for the rest of the day is significantly less. Basically, you set your brain up how your brain's going to work that day from how you begin the first few minutes of your day. So if you get up and you're immediately checking your phone, looking at your social media, checking your email, all that kind of stuff, that's what your brain's going to do all day. Whereas if you get up and you go for a walk or exercise, then take a shower, make yourself some breakfast, do all those kinds of things before you check all that stuff, then your brain is kind of set up to work differently and work in a more healthy way. That can even, if your dopamine trigger is food, that can be fasting. I've done some other stuff on fasting. Maybe I'll post another video, a longer video on it. But when I fast, I always find that my the next day, the next few days, my cravings for sugar go away, my cravings for alcohol go away. Instead, I want healthy food and like clean, clear, cold water. Those are the things I crave. I just want them. When you reset, your body's like, oh no, we don't need that. I need this. So that's a form of dopamine detox. The last short term I would say is getting up and go moving. You know, like I said, a walking regimen or exercise program. It doesn't have to be anything really intense. Getting your body moving, anything to get your body moving. We spend a lot of our life sedentary. By getting our bodies moving, we lower our cortisol levels and we increase our serotonin levels. If you get your body moving by doing something new, like I'm doing with rope flow, every time I achieve a new movement, learn a new movement, get a new transition, whatever, I get that dopamine, and then I also get the long-term benefits of the health impact of that, which leads to serotonin. So that's another way to lower your cortisol level. Is just get out there and get moving. Make it a habit, just get moving, because it impacts your day, especially early in the day. If you can do your exercise, your walking routine first thing in the morning, that kind of sets you up for the whole day. It lowers your stress levels for the whole day moving forward. Alternately, you could do it at the end of your work day. So between work and home, you get home, then you go for a walk, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and that helps you unwind and let go of all that stress, because we already know walking helps reduce stress, but you let go of that, and that sets you up short term for the rest of the evening. Then you can, when you're nice and relaxed, and maybe staying off social media, maybe not doing so much electronic TV and stuff and screen time, then you go to bed and you sleep better, and that sets you up for the next day. So those are kind of the medium term things to begin incorporating on a regular basis that will help you begin to lower your stress levels, your cortisol levels, and bring your serotonin and dopamine back into balance. Now let's talk about the long-term ones. I already mentioned meditation. That's a good long-term one. Developing an exercise routine, exercise habit, whether it's walking, going to the gym, rock climbing, hiking, swimming, joining an intramural sports team, whatever it is. Getting out there and doing that kind of stuff long-term is going to help you enormously. A lot of stress comes from our social activities or lack thereof. Creating new healthy social activities is a big way to reduce your overall stress. And as I said earlier, serotonin, life happiness comes from being part of a community. So again, joining an intramural sports team, volunteering for something that is meaningful to you, where you meet other people who are like-minded, you develop that community. Getting involved in anything like that, creating healthy social environments rather than going out to a bar where you're social, but you're also engaging in dopamine activities like drinking. Getting more involved in more social activities and doing them without substances helps you develop that deeper connection with people and lowers your stress levels, increases your serotonin, balances out your dopamine. So that's going to be a big thing, is improving your social network, your social connections to help with that. Another big stressor is, and this one is going to be probably really, really important for some of you watching, but also one of the more difficult things to implement, but absolutely critical for a healthy life. And that is setting boundaries. Whether it's work, friendships, romantic relationships, family relationships, setting and enforcing boundaries. And I'm going to do a whole video on that. There are lots of other resources that you can look for to find out about how to implement those properly. But the key is that if those relationships are causing you stress, you need to set boundaries and enforce those boundaries to reduce that stress. And I've seen this over and over and over with my clients, especially with their family and their romantic relationships. When you set those boundaries and enforce them, their stress levels go down. At first, the setting of the boundaries and the enforcing of them might be stressful. It usually is. But the long-term benefit is that you reduce stress overall in your life, which lowers your cortisol levels and raises your serotonin and balances your dopamine, and you have a better quality of life because you've reduced the amount of drama and stress. So that's going to be a long-term goal, but it absolutely works, and it pays huge, huge dividends for years to come. So that is one that's absolutely critical. Definitely recommend that to anybody. Look at your relationships. If you need to start setting boundaries, start doing that. All right, prioritizing sleep. This is a big one. When you sleep, and I mean sleep in a healthy way, not knock yourself out with drugs or alcohol, but when you sleep healthy, your central nervous system, your brain literally like clears out physiological junk. Like it's like like your kidneys filter your blood. Well, there's stuff in the liquid around your brain and your spine and stuff that needs to be filtered out. And so that sleeping activity helps do that. It also helps you reset your brain, helps you lock in long-term memories, lock in new skills that you've learned, and just helps you function better the day after, which if you're more mentally clear and functioning better, you're gonna do better at work, you're gonna respond to stressful situations in a more thoughtful way, you're not gonna be as upset by them. All this is a huge benefit of just prioritizing sleep. And if you have trouble sleeping, there's lots of different ways that you can improve your sleep. There's lots of things to look at. One of them is screen time. Cutting down on your screen time a couple hours before sleep is a huge one for a lot of people. Again, that goes hand in hand with the screen time is the blue light that keeps you awake, but at the same time, you're also engaging in media, which is making you feel bad. You're engaging in social media, which is making you feel bad and triggering dopamine. It goes hand in hand. You're beginning to see how a lot of these things overlap and interconnect. It's like a huge Venn diagram of stuff that's just messing with you. Next strategy is new hobbies. What is it that you wanted to try? What is it that you've always wanted to do and just haven't done? Do it. Get out there and try it. Try a pottery class or rope flow or yoga or basket weaving. I don't know. There's anything. Like just whatever it is that you're interested in, do it. Engaging your brain in something that interests you totally lowers your stress because for so many reasons. And it helps balance that serotonin and dopamine levels. Because for one, when you're engaged in something new that you're really interested in, you become focused. It's very much like meditation. Your inner monologue shuts off and you're just doing the thing. On top of which, so when you're doing that, you're lowering your stress levels then. On top of which, you get the dopamine from learning something new. Oh man, I finally did that after I've been trying for so long. And you get that serotonin level from that long-term achievement. Man, look at this thing I made. Look at this thing I achieved. And I feel more confident in myself. And if it's something that involves other people, going to a class or a club or whatever, then you're also getting the social thing. So all of these things begin to overlap and you develop new friendships, healthier friendships, hopefully with people who have things in common with you, and you begin to have those conversations and make those connections, and all of this stuff brings it all together. Which brings me to the last thing that is huge in reducing your overall stress and raising your serotonin, balancing your dopamine, and creating a life that is meaningful and worthwhile to you, and that is discovering your life purpose. I cannot tell you how much of a game changer that is. Some of us know from when we're very young what we're meant to do. Most of us do not. And figuring that out, taking the time to figure that out, and however it is you need to do that. And it takes a lot of self-exploration and self-honesty and a lot of courage. But once you do, having that knowledge of yourself and what you're meant to do in the world and why you're here and how that is giving back to the world changes everything. Having meaning in your life lowers your stress levels, lowers your cortisol, gives you that serotonin that says this is the life I'm meant to lead. So it gives you a better overall quality of life, sense of fulfillment, sense of meaning. So that is the last thing. That's where I'm going to leave this on is hopefully all of this is being useful to you. Leave a comment. Let me know what your big takeaways are, which of these you're going to try and how effective they are, and where you're finding your big stressors, and maybe what your dopamine triggers are, and what you're going to use, which of these strategies or something else that you're going to use to kind of combat that, what you're going to do to reduce your stress. I want to know it all. Leave it a comment below. If you found this useful or you know anyone who will, please share it with them, because that's the whole reason I do this. I just want to help everybody live a better life. And if you want to have a more personal conversation, look into whether coaching would help you with some of these issues. That's what I do. My name is Charles. I'm a life coach. I have a huge focus on helping people live more fulfilling lives, which is why I make these videos. So if that sounds like something that would be helpful to you, there's a link to my scheduling below. We can schedule a conversation and see whether that would work for you. So that's it for today. Again, I'm Charles, Revelcraft Life Coaching. I love you all. Peace. See ya.